The receipt fluttered onto the marble counter, confirming the address. 47 East Lane, Apt 3B. Not his office, not mine. I had seen the charge 5 minutes earlier on our shared credit card statement, a staggering $450 at Petals of Paradise. But seeing the delivery confirmation, the delicate handwriting indicating the recipient's name, made the air in our perfectly arranged kitchen thick and metallic. The expensive bouquet of lilies wasn't for me, the wife celebrating 10 years of marriage next month. It was for her. My name is Amelia, and for the last decade, I believed I had mastered the art of stability. My life with Ben was a well-oiled machine, predictable, comfortable, and built on a foundation of seemingly absolute trust. We had the mortgage, the dog, the shared retirement accounts, and the implicit understanding that we were each other's safe harbor. I wasn't just his wife. I was his partner in every sense of the word. Or so I thought, until that damned vanilla scent started clinging to his clothes. It began subtly, about 6 weeks ago. Ben would come home late from what he called late closing meetings. He'd toss his suit jacket over the chair, and when I went to hang it up, I'd catch it, a cloying, artificial fragrance, like cheap vanilla air freshener mixed with strong floral lotion. Ben always smelled like sandalwood and fresh laundry. This new sweet scent was alien and irritating. When I first pointed it out, he laughed it off. "Must be Susan from accounting," he'd say, rolling his eyes. "She drowns herself in the stuff." I accepted the explanation, because rejecting it meant opening a door I wasn't ready to walk through. Denial is a powerful anesthetic. But the vanilla persisted. It was on his shirts, faint but undeniable, a sticky, sugary shadow that followed him into our bed. It started mixing with something else I recognized, the sharp, acrid odor of guilt. The signs escalated from scents to actions. His phone became a sacred, untouchable artifact, always face down, always muted. He started taking long, rambling calls in the garage, claiming poor reception. He joined a gym, a beautiful, expensive facility 10 miles out of his way, and suddenly needed new designer workout clothes. All the while, he grew distant, stressed, and vaguely irritated by my presence. "What is going on, Ben?" I finally asked one Tuesday night, watching him meticulously shred a piece of paper over the recycling bin. He sighed, running a hand through his perpetually neat hair. "It's work, Amy. Just a huge merger. I'm exhausted. Can we not fight?" We didn't fight. I retreated into silence, but the paranoia took root and began to bloom, poisonous and fast. I knew what I had to do. Ben handled all the joint finances, but I still had access to the digital statements. I logged in, heart hammering against my ribs, fully prepared to find nothing but anxiety-induced delusion. And then I saw it. The Petals of Paradise charge. $450. On a Tuesday, the same day he came home smelling so strongly of vanilla that I nearly gagged. My blood turned to ice, but my mind became crystal clear. Cheaters always get sloppy with money. They think large, legitimate purchases won't be questioned. But Ben had made 2 critical mistakes. He used the shared account, and he had the receipt emailed to his work address, which synced directly to our shared cloud backup. I found the email. The subject line was, "Delivery confirmation, lilies for L." L, not Amy. I copied the delivery address into Google Maps. It was a high-end office complex downtown. Then, with an eerie calm that surprised even me, I navigated back to the Petals of Paradise website. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't even slam the laptop shut. I felt cold, surgical rage. I selected the most ostentatious arrangement I could find. A dozen long-stemmed bright red roses, the classic symbol of forbidden love. Total cost, $395. I meticulously entered Ben's credit card details, the very card he used to buy the lilies for his little affair. For the delivery address, I used the same office complex. But instead of the recipient being L, I put the name of the company's HR director, whom I knew professionally. Then, the card message. I typed it slowly, making sure every word was, perfect, allowing the vengeance to flow through my fingertips like electricity. The message read, "Enjoy the scent of vanilla, darling. I'll be taking the house. Check your email. Amelia." I clicked confirm order. The satisfaction was immediate, devastating, and absolutely intoxicating. That second order, paid for with his own guilt money, was my declaration of war, delivered right into the heart of their shared delusion. When Ben finally walked through the door that evening, he didn't smell like vanilla or sandalwood. He smelled like pure distilled fear. He saw the open laptop on the kitchen counter, the receipt still fluttering slightly near the screen. He saw the cold, empty look in my eyes. "Amy, what is this?" he whispered, his voice cracking. I didn't dignify the question with a direct answer. "Did you know that vanilla is often used to mask other, stronger odors, Ben? Like desperation, perhaps? Or maybe the smell of a life you just threw away?" He knew immediately. The flowers had been delivered. Not just the roses, but the message, causing a public, undeniable spectacle in the corporate office. The HR director had emailed him immediately, attaching my scathing note. His affair was exposed, not by a tearful confrontation, but by a flawlessly executed, financially documented act of revenge. I walked away that night, leaving him standing there in our perfect silent kitchen, surrounded by the ghosts of our decade together. The divorce was fast, ugly, and entirely in my favor. Ben tried to negotiate, tried to apologize, but there was nothing left to salvage. Once trust evaporates, only ash remains. It's been 6 months since I changed the locks. My life is quiet now, less comfortable perhaps, but infinitely more real. I learned that the smallest sign, a lingering scent, a misplaced receipt, can be the entire truth if you're brave enough to look at it. Sometimes you don't need a shouting match or a dramatic scene to end things. Sometimes all you need is a credit card, a florist, and a perfect, damning message. Never ignore the small details, because they are rarely small. And if you've ever had a doubt that made your stomach churn, don't dismiss it. Trust your gut. I did, and it led me to freedom. Tell me, what was the first tiny detail you noticed that turned out to be the biggest sign of all? Let me know in the comments below. It's easy to look back now, sitting here in my quiet, sunlit apartment, and see the exact moment the rot began, the precise fracture in the foundation of my marriage. But in the thick of it, when you're swimming in comfort and belief, those moments are invisible, disguised as stress, forgetfulness, or just the mundane shifts of a decade-long relationship. Mark and I had what everyone else envied: stability, shared laughter, and a mortgage we were actually managing to pay off early. We were the success story. That confidence was my shield, and for a long time, it blinded me to the subtle, almost imperceptible shifts in Mark's orbit. The first detail wasn't the damning evidence, it was the scent. Not perfume, but a sharp masculine cologne he'd never worn before, something woodsy and aggressive. He'd smell of it after his late meetings, which had suddenly become an almost weekly occurrence. When I asked about it, he shrugged, blaming a new client who smoked expensive cigars. "It clings, you know. I hate it." I bought the explanation immediately because I wanted to. Then came the phone. Mark was notoriously careless with his devices, often leaving them on the kitchen counter while he showered. Now it was always face down, always silenced, and always within arm's reach. If I entered the room, he'd finish whatever text he was sending with a sudden final flourish and lock the screen, placing it into his pocket with a casual movement that screamed premeditation. The doubt started as a tiny, persistent tickle in the back of my throat. It wasn't jealousy. It was cognitive dissonance. The man I knew, open, predictable, a terrible liar, was behaving like a completely different person. I kept telling myself I was being paranoid, reading too much into corporate pressure. But the tickle grew into a gnawing ache, forcing me to confront the dreadful possibility. I wasn't crazy, and something was terribly wrong. The turning point involved the financials. Mark managed the joint accounts. He was meticulous, almost pathologically so, balancing the budget down to the last cent every Sunday morning. That stopped. He started doing the review in his home office, door closed, claiming he needed total focus. I didn't press until a notification popped up on my email, a notification for a credit card statement summary I hadn't seen in months, one we rarely used, reserved mainly for travel, expenses. I waited until Mark left for a supposed overnight conference. The house felt cavernous and cold. Sitting at his desk, the silence was broken only by the frantic drumming of my own heart. I logged into the bank portal, my hands shaking so badly I mistyped the password 3 times. The fear wasn't of confirming the affair. The fear was the obliteration of my reality. When the statement loaded, my eyes scanned for the obvious. Hotel bills, expensive dinners, jewelry. What I found was both less dramatic and infinitely more chilling. There was a recurring charge, once a month for the last 5 months, always on a Thursday afternoon, always the same amount, $150. The vendor name was Petals and Promises Floral Design. We never sent flowers. Not to each other, not to clients, not even to his mother, who preferred chocolate. And Petals and Promises was not the local shop down the street. It was an upscale boutique 40 miles away, in a neighborhood known for lavish, discreet deliveries. A $150 charge once a month for 5 months. It wasn't a sudden, passionate mistake. It was a scheduled ritual. It was routine. The knowledge hit me like a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs. But beneath the shock, a cold, hard clarity took hold. I wasn't going to scream or confront him based on circumstantial evidence. I needed the final, undeniable proof. I needed the message. I looked up the florist's number and called them, adopting a cheerful, slightly demanding tone. Hi, I'm calling about an order placed earlier today under the name Mark Hayes. It's a rush delivery, and I just need to confirm the card message. He tends to be vague. The woman on the other end, accustomed to dealing with frantic spouses or forgetful assistants, pulled up the order without hesitation. Let me see. Yes, a beautiful arrangement. $150 going to an office building downtown. The card reads, "To my dearest, for 5 perfect months. Can't wait for forever." 5 perfect months. That was the timeline. That was the anniversary. And the location, an office building downtown, confirmed the recipient was someone he saw daily, professionally involved, someone who was not me. I hung up the phone, not crying, but feeling a profound, terrifying stillness. The investigation was over. I had the who, the where, and the why. But the card message, "Can't wait for forever," that was the definitive nail in the coffin of our life together. It was a promise made to someone else, paid for with our shared resources. I knew exactly what I had to do next. I didn't need a shouting match or a dramatic scene to end things. I needed to let him know that I knew, using the very tools of his deceit. I went straight to the joint account and performed the only act that could speak louder than any argument. I transferred every cent, leaving just enough to cover the standing monthly bills, and then I changed all the passwords. The next morning, I drove to Petals and Promises myself. I ordered the biggest, most ostentatious arrangement they had, something blindingly white and expensive, costing nearly 5 times the amount of his monthly ritual delivery. I paid for it using the same credit card Mark had used. And the message? I wrote it myself, short, surgical, and final. It was the last thing he would ever receive from me, delivered not to his mistress, but directly to his office desk. It was the perfect, damning message that signaled the end. Because sometimes, the only way to truly win is to use their own small details to build your freedom. The package was gone. Delivered, signed for, and placed strategically on the desk he shared with his assistant, the desk where he often left his phone facing down, claiming professional courtesy, but really hiding the flicker of new notifications. I watched the tracking. Notification switched to completed and felt a strange, hollow relief. It was over. Not the pain, never the pain, but the protracted, sickening game of pretense. My name is Amelia, and for 7 years, I was Mark's perfectly curated wife, the anchor he claimed kept his high-flying world grounded. I was the silent partner in his success, managing the home, the social calendar, and his delicate ego. Until I became the forensic investigator of my own marriage, digging through the wreckage of his lies like an archaeologist unearthing ancient, sharp shards. The shift didn't happen with a bang, but with the quiet, persistent drip of water-eroding stone. Mark was a man of ritual. His morning coffee was precisely 180 degrees. His shirts were always ironed with heavy starch, and his deliveries, those carefully curated monthly subscriptions he adored, arrived every third Tuesday. I didn't question the deliveries. They were his little luxuries. I didn't question the late nights. They were the price of his ambition. I didn't question the new lock on his phone. I simply accepted his explanation that corporate security was tightening. The doubt, that cold, insidious whisper, began with the scent. It wasn't perfume. I knew his expensive, woody cologne and the faint trace of my own lily-of-the-valley body lotion that clung to his sweaters. This was different. A sharp, synthetic smell, almost metallic, like industrial detergent, mixed with cheap plastic. It was the smell of a dry cleaner that wasn't ours. I mentioned it once, casually, tracing the line of his jaw while we watched a movie. He stiffened, pulling back slightly. Just the office, honey. They use those terrible industrial cleaners now. A small lie, easily dismissed, yet it stuck in my throat like a fishbone. Then came the financial trail, the only place Mark truly became sloppy. He trusted technology to obscure his tracks, relying on auto-pay and paperless billing. But I had access to the joint account. I managed the household budget with the precision of a Swiss clock. One afternoon, reviewing the quarterly statements, I saw it. A recurring charge marked simply as luxury goods delivery, always processed late in the evening on the third Tuesday of the month. It was the same date his own ritual deliveries arrived. The amounts varied, small at first, $70, $120, but they escalated quickly, peaking at $400 for a single purchase last month. My heart didn't race. It contracted into a hard, cold knot. I didn't confront him. Confrontation was for amateurs. I needed proof, undeniable evidence that connected the charges to a physical location, and most importantly, to Hearn. I became a creature of shadows and algorithms. While Mark slept, exhausted from his meetings, I worked. His laptop was protected by a simple password variation of our old dog's name. Predictable. I waited until now, the early hours, sliding the machine onto my lap, the screen glow illuminating the fear and resolve in my eyes. I didn't look for emails or texts. Those are easy to delete. I looked for the ghost in the machine, the saved credit card data, the autofill suggestions, the crumbs left in the browser history caches. It took me 3 nights to connect the dots. The luxury goods delivery charge led me to a high-end online boutique specializing in bespoke, almost painfully feminine, attire. The site required a membership, which Mark had foolishly saved. I logged in. There, in the order history, were the items: silk scarves, delicate jewelry, and finally, the item that confirmed my darkest suspicions. A specific, expensive designer dress, blindingly white, purchased just last week. But the delivery address was the crucial detail. It wasn't ours. It was a postal box downtown, registered under a company name that I quickly cross-referenced with local business filings. The company was Shell Corporation, yes, but the address was also linked to a small upscale apartment building near the financial district. An apartment building I knew Mark visited frequently for client dinners. The name wasn't immediately apparent in the records, but the pieces were interlocking perfectly. Mark was not only cheating, but he was creating a parallel life, funding it with our shared future, and using the exact ritual of his own, self-indulgence, the third Tuesday delivery, to spoil his mistress. The tension in our house became a thick, suffocating blanket. I smiled, I cooked, I asked about his day, all while carrying the weight of his betrayal and the blueprint for his downfall. Every casual touch he offered felt like acid on my skin. I began sleeping in the guest room, claiming stress and needing solitude, which he accepted without question. That lack of concern was a louder scream than any argument we could have had. He was too consumed by his secret to notice the gaping chasm between us. The final piece fell into place when I accessed his work calendar remotely, using the shared cloud service he'd forgotten I still had access to. The mistress, whose name I finally found through a forgotten loyalty program membership attached to the delivery address, was listed as a junior consultant at a rival firm he was supposedly trying to poach. Her name was Chloe. Chloe, who had the audacity to receive blindingly white, expensive dresses delivered on our dime, matching his own predictable schedule. This realization wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a cold fusion. The investigation had stripped away my role as a trusting wife and replaced it with a calculated operative. I wasn't just hurt. I was insulted by the sheer predictability and laziness of his infidelity. That's when I bought the second dress, the one mentioned earlier. It had to be the exact same style as the one Mark purchased for Chloe, but slightly more expensive and pristine white. I used Mark's own credit card, the one linked to the luxury delivery charges, to pay for it. The message I included was short, surgical, and final, addressed to him. This time, not her, and delivered not to the apartment, but directly to his office desk. It was the final nail in the coffin, delivered while he was in a morning conference call. The message read, "Enjoy the white, dress Mark. It matches the color of your lies. I'll take the house, the savings, and the third Tuesday delivery schedule. Consider this my final gift." Watching the delivery confirmation flash across my screen, I finally allowed myself to breathe deeply for the first time in months. I had used his own small, predictable details, the credit card, the delivery schedule, the symbolic white dress, to dismantle the life he had so carelessly risked. Sometimes, the only way to truly win is not to rage, but to use their own sloppy evidence to construct your freedom, one perfectly executed detail at a time. The game was finished, and Mark was about to receive the shock of his life, a consequence delivered with the same silent, undeniable precision he used to hide his betrayal. It's strange how an entire reality can crumble over the smallest, most insignificant detail. For months, our life together had been a meticulously crafted tapestry of comfort and predictability. Mark was the architect of our stability, or so I believed. My first real doubt didn't come from a lipstick stain or a late-night text. It came from a simple, almost surgical shift in his habits. He started leaving his phone face down on the nightstand. Not always, but often enough to register. Before, he tossed it carelessly, screen up, buzzing notifications visible to anyone in the room. Now, it was a deliberate placement, a shield. I rationalized it. Maybe The light was bothering him. Maybe it was a new privacy setting at work. But the nagging started. A tiny, persistent itch under the skin of our perfect marriage. A low-level hum that grew louder whenever I watched him sleep. Then came the expense report. Mark traveled frequently for business, and I handled the household finances, a division of labor we had established years ago. This month, there was a charge for an expensive boutique florist, a place known for custom, high-end arrangements, not standard corporate gifts. The charge was subtle, buried between a large hotel bill and an airline ticket. When I asked him about it, his response was immediate, almost too slick. Oh, that was for Mrs. Henderson, the CEO's wife. Retirement party set up. Had to cover it personally. Company will reimburse later. He didn't even meet my eyes. He was already practicing the lie, rehearsing the lines in the mirror of his own self-deception. The suspicion, once planted, grew roots like a malignant weed. I found myself watching him, not lovingly, but analytically. His showers became longer. He started humming songs I didn't recognize. He'd check his watch constantly when we were out, seemingly eager for the night to end. The physical gap between us widened. When I reached for his hand, he'd offer a shoulder. When I tried to initiate intimacy, he'd suddenly be exhausted from a demanding day. He was conserving his energy, I realized, for someone else. I knew I couldn't accuse him based on a hidden phone and a florist bill. Mark was too smart, too practiced in corporate deception. He would dismantle my emotional argument instantly, turning my doubt into hysteria. I needed proof that was cold, hard, and undeniable. My investigation had to be as silent and efficient as his betrayal. The first hurdle was his digital fortress. He had recently changed the password to his main laptop, a subtle maneuver he explained away as new security protocol. But Mark was inherently lazy about passwords. He used patterns. I spent 3 sleepless nights running through combinations based on old anniversaries, the dog's birthday, and his mother's maiden name. Nothing. I was about to give up, sinking into the despair of knowing, but not being able to prove, when I remembered something truly mundane. The access code to the gym locker he hated, but used religiously because it was closest to the parking lot. It worked. The relief wasn't joy. It was a profound, cold satisfaction. The click of a lock giving way to absolute certainty. Once inside his email, the floodgates didn't open immediately. He was careful, deleting most of the direct correspondence. But Mark forgot the cardinal rule of digital security. The cloud remembers everything, especially receipts. Hidden deep in a folder labeled Q4 Budget Planning, I found a series of forwarded emails, confirmation of reservations, small gifts, and then the centerpiece, the tracking information for the custom-made white cocktail dress. It wasn't a wedding dress, but it was white, symbolic of the new life he was trying to build, and the timing was significant. It was scheduled for delivery to his office address, 2 days before the annual charity gala we were supposed to attend together. He wasn't buying me a surprise dress. He was fitting someone else for an event that defined our social standing. He was replacing me, not just secretly, but openly, planning to parade her past our closest friends, banking on my ignorance or my silence. The delivery schedule became my weapon. Mark was so focused on the grand lie that he overlooked the predictable mechanics of logistics. I knew the exact time the package would arrive at his office reception, and I knew his assistant, Sarah, was notoriously unreliable before 10 a.m. I didn't steal the dress. That would have been too messy. I waited until the tracking confirmed delivered, and then I called the courier service, using a voice so calm it surprised even me. Yes, this is Mr. Hawthorne's personal assistant. He's requested an urgent reroute. The package was sent to the wrong floor. I need it held at the main depot for personal pickup this afternoon. A few quick professional excuses, a reference number I had fabricated from a previous delivery, and the courier agreed, apologetically. Mark would arrive at his office, expecting a pristine white box, only to find an empty spot and a confused Sarah claiming she never saw it. Panic would set in, the first tiny consequence of his actions. But the dress was only the appetizer. The real shock was the credit card statement I had meticulously gathered. He had opened a separate card for his escapades, believing I would never check the secondary account linked to our shared credit line. Every dinner, every hotel, every weekend trip, all documented. I didn't just print the statements. I framed them, professionally mounted, ready for display. The final piece was the timing. Tonight was the night we were supposed to finalize the paperwork for the house refinancing. A large, important financial discussion that required both our signatures and a serious, sober approach. Mark would arrive home expecting to sign documents and discuss mortgage rates. Instead, he would find me, sitting at the dining table, bathed in the cool light of the chandelier, not with mortgage papers, but with 3 perfectly organized stacks of indisputable evidence, the framed statements resting right next to the lawyer's card. The silence in the house now was heavy, charged with all the unspoken history and the future that was about to be obliterated. I heard the distant grind of his car pulling into the driveway. My hand rested on the stack of papers. There was no anger left, just a cold, focused clarity. He thought he was playing a game of secrecy. I was playing a game of absolute, irreversible closure. He was about to walk through that door, expecting to continue the masquerade. He was about to walk into the final act of a life he had already signed away. I took a deep breath, smoothing the crease out of the top page. The precision of the execution was everything. This wasn't revenge. This was justice delivered by calculation. The door, handle turned, and the key clicked in the lock. The shock was palpable, even before he saw my face. I watched the door open, ready to deliver the silence he deserved. "You look surprised, Mark." The words were a flat line, devoid of the warmth or rage he might have expected. They hung in the air of the hallway, a sterile declaration of war. He stood framed by the doorway, his expensive Italian leather briefcase dangling loosely from one hand, his face a perfect mask of shock. The calculating smile he usually wore, the one that had charmed me for 10 years, had dissolved into something sickly and panicked. He didn't even drop the briefcase. He simply froze, realizing the stage was set, and he hadn't memorized his lines. I held the document higher, letting the official court seal catch the harsh ceiling light. He squinted, trying to read the header from a distance, but the specific legal jargon wasn't what mattered. What mattered was the weight of the paper in my hand, the sheer finality it represented. This moment, this quiet, devastating confrontation, was the end result of 6 agonizing months of self-doubt, paranoia, and cold, relentless investigation. It all started, as betrayals often do, not with a bang, but with a faint, irritating hum. Mark's rhythms had changed. Not the usual shift from busy work period to quiet one, but a fundamental alteration in his baseline frequency. He had always been meticulously organized, but suddenly, that organization became secretive. He started locking his office door at home, something he hadn't done since he first brought proprietary files home years ago. When I asked about it, he gave me the standard, placating answer. "Just high-level security stuff, honey. You know how the board is." But it was the small things that truly drilled the doubt into my soul, turning the hum into a persistent, throbbing ache. The sudden switch from print bank statements to electronic ones, which he assured me was for environmental reasons. The way he started having his car serviced at a location 40 miles away, claiming the local mechanics were incompetent. And then, the key. I found the key hidden in an old ski jacket I was donating. It was small, tarnished, and clearly the key to a safe deposit box. I confronted him about it casually, pretending I'd found it loose in a drawer. "Oh, that old thing?" He had laughed too, quickly, too loudly. "That's just the key to my father's old military medals. I need to get rid of them sometime." It was a plausible lie, but the way his eyes darted away, that tiny, imperceptible flicker, told me everything I needed to know about his sincerity. I hated myself for what I became next. I wasn't a detective. I was a loving wife who suddenly found herself playing the role of a private investigator in her own life. The doubt was corrosive, making me question every shared memory, every whispered promise. Was I being paranoid? Was this marriage simply hitting the decade slump? Mark was gaslighting me with his predictable affection and routine, making me feel crazy for even considering that something sinister was lurking beneath the surface of our comfortable life. But the key was too heavy to ignore. Using his father's old medals as an excuse felt flimsy, especially since his father had been cremated without military honors years ago. I hired a discreet locksmith, not to break in, but to identify the type of key. It was, as I suspected, a safety deposit box key for a major downtown bank, one Mark had never mentioned using. The tension during those weeks was unbearable. I lived in a state of hyper-awareness, analyzing his every word, his breathing, the way he slept. I waited for him to take a business trip, feigning mild flu symptoms so he wouldn't press me to accompany him. The moment his flight took off, I was in a cab, clutching the key and a forged authorization letter, a necessity I deeply regretted, but one I accepted as vital to my survival. The true revelation was a physical blow, worse than any punch. I opened the box, expecting to find evidence of an affair, photos, jewelry, maybe even a second passport. What I found was infinitely colder and more terrifying. A stack of meticulously organized legal documents. They weren't love letters. They were death warrants for my financial future. There were copies of wire transfers moving millions into shell corporations based in the Cayman Islands. There were detailed asset allocation spreadsheets designed to completely bypass our marital estate. And nestled right on top, the absolute smoking gun, was a prenuptial agreement. An agreement I had adamantly refused to sign when we married. An agreement that Mark had somehow resurrected, and impossibly signed in my name. My hands shook, but not with fear, with a blinding, incandescent clarity. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was a methodical, planned execution of my life, designed to leave me destitute and confused while he sailed off into the sunset. He hadn't just betrayed me. He had committed a felony. I didn't weep. I didn't scream. I transformed. The next 3 months were a blur of lawyers, forensic accountants, and handwriting experts. I played the loving wife, kissing him goodbye in the morning, listening to his fabricated stories about stressful meetings, all while building an impenetrable legal case against him. I was leveraging his own illegal actions to achieve a comprehensive, immediate freeze on every penny he had tried to hide. Which brought me back to the present, to the moment Mark's face went white under the cruel light of the hallway. He finally lowered his briefcase, the leather hitting the hardwood floor with a soft thud that sounded deafeningly loud. "What is this, Sarah? Just tell me," he whispered, his voice cracking, the facade of control completely shattered. "This, Mark," I said, stepping forward so the distance between us was erased, "is the emergency injunction. It freezes every single asset related to the 3 shell corporations you established between last October and this March. And this section," I pointed to the 5th paragraph, detailing the forensic evidence, "is the documentation of the forgery. I filed the criminal report an hour ago. The police should be here in under 10 minutes to discuss the charges of fraud and grand larceny." His mouth opened, but no sound came out. I watched the realization dawn in his eyes. He had walked into a trap of his own making, and the woman he thought he had successfully dismantled was the one holding the hammer. The silence I delivered was not just the absence of noise, it was the complete catastrophic silence of his future collapsing. I let the silence linger, a concrete weight pressing down on his chest until I could practically hear his heartbeat stutter. Mark, the man I had loved, the man who had perfected the art of the charming, devoted husband for 10 long years, was finally seeing the real reflection in my eyes. Not the soft, trusting woman he thought he had discarded, but the architect of his downfall. You really thought I wouldn't check, didn't you, Mark? My voice was low, steady, lacking the hysteria he had anticipated. That lack of emotion was the sharpest blade I possessed. You believed I was too focused on the decor and the dinner parties to notice you were systematically emptying our accounts, forging my signature on the deeds, and planning your grand exit. My name is Eleanor Vance, and until 6 months ago, I was living what looked like the perfect life in the wealthiest corner of the city. Mark was a successful investment banker, a man whose charisma could charm the paint off a wall and whose touch was still sometimes electric. We had built a life on apparent solid ground, beautiful home, joint ventures, and mutual admiration, or so I believed. I handled the domestic side, the charities, the social calendar, while he handled the empire, trusting him implicitly with every financial detail. That, I now realize, was the ultimate vulnerability I handed him on a silver platter. I didn't just trust him, I outsourced my vigilance. The first crack appeared not as a tremor, but as a faint, almost imperceptible shadow. It was an innocuous detail, the kind of thing you dismiss because your husband is Mark, and Mark is above reproach. We were refinancing a property upstate, a cottage we rarely used but kept for sentimental value. He handled all the paperwork, naturally. I remember him rushing me one Saturday morning, pushing a stack of documents toward me. Sign here, Elle. It's just boilerplate for the escrow release. Need to send it off today. I signed without reading. It was a practiced reflex cultivated over a decade. But a week later, I received an unsolicited email from our longtime accountant, David, regarding a tax filing for that same property. David was usually meticulous, but the email seemed strangely formal, almost cold. He mentioned needing my signature on a specific addendum that Mark had supposedly forgotten. When I asked Mark about it later that night, he became instantly defensive, a reaction totally disproportionate to the query. David is micromanaging, Elle. I handled it. You don't need to worry about the finer details, he snapped, tossing his briefcase onto the sofa with unusual force. It wasn't the harshness that troubled me. It was the avoidance. Mark never avoided financial discussions. He loved discussing his triumphs. The conversation felt like a door slamming shut in my face. A seed of doubt, cold and small, planted itself in my gut. Why was he lying about something so trivial? The doubt quickly grew into a nagging suspicion that gnawed at the edges of my sleep. I started paying attention, not to his actions in public, which were flawless, but to the tiny, mundane logistics of our shared life. I began noticing patterns. He took his briefcase to the office every single day, even when he claimed he was only meeting a client for lunch. He insisted on separate passwords for his work laptop, something he'd never done before, citing new company security protocols. Then came the night I found the key. He was away on a supposed business trip to Singapore. I was cleaning out a drawer in his rarely used study desk, searching for an old warranty card for the wine cellar, when my fingers brushed against a small, metallic object tucked beneath the velvet lining of the stationery tray. It was a key, heavier than an ordinary house key, with a specific, almost antique etching. My heart hammered against my ribs. I knew instinctively what it was. It was the key to the wall safe hidden behind the painting in our master bedroom. The safe where we kept important documents, jewelry, and, crucially, our original marriage certificate and the deeds to our main properties. For 10 years, that safe had been a symbol of our shared security. We used the digital combination lock, not the physical key. Mark always insisted the key was kept in the bank vault. I didn't hesitate. I held the key, my hand trembling not from fear, but from a terrifying cold certainty. I went upstairs, pulled down the heavy portrait, and inserted the key. The contents of the safe confirmed my worst nightmares. The safe was nearly empty. Our original property deeds were gone, replaced by thick manila folders containing copies. The jewelry was there. He hadn't touched the superficial assets, but the crucial legal and financial documents were missing. Worse, I found a small folded receipt from a private document storage facility across town, dated 3 months prior. This wasn't just a midlife crisis or a fling. This was premeditated financial destruction. He wasn't cheating on me with a woman. He was cheating me out of my future. I didn't confront him immediately. I wasn't going to be the hysterical wife who spoiled her own evidence. I needed proof that would stand up in a courtroom. The next 3 months were a blur of calculated secrecy. While Mark was busy perfecting his deceit, I was busy perfecting my trap. I hired an independent forensic accounting firm under the guise of estate planning for my elderly aunt. I routed all communications through a burner phone and a private email address I accessed only at the local library, far from our shared Wi-Fi network. The accountants found the holes first. Large transfers routed through shell companies in the Cayman Islands, structured sales of property, assets I was unaware of, and, most damningly, proof of expertly forged signatures on bank withdrawal authorizations and property transfer agreements. The signature on the refinancing document for the upstate cottage, it wasn't mine. It was a digital ghost of my hand, expertly recreated. I took the evidence directly to Detective Miller, a friend of a friend known for his integrity. Bypassing local police who might have been too well acquainted with Mark's influential circle, I laid out the binders, the transaction logs, the expert testimony on the forgeries, and then I waited. I acted the part of the oblivious wife until this afternoon. I told Mark I wanted to celebrate his return from Singapore. Champagne, catered dinner, the whole charade. He walked in, expecting adoration, and perhaps a quick departure to meet his mistress or his lawyer. Instead, he found me, calm, composed, holding the full truth in my hands. I filed the criminal report an hour ago, Mark, I repeated, letting the weight of the statement settle back into the present moment, watching the polished veneer crack and crumble. The police should be here in under 10 minutes to discuss the charges of fraud and grand larceny. They will also be very interested in the contents of the storage unit you rented, which I accessed legally this morning with a court order based on the evidence of systematic theft. His face was a masterpiece of horror and disbelief. He started to sway, reaching out blindly for the mahogany desk, trying to find purchase in the reality that had just tilted violently on its axis. Eleanor, you can't. He finally choked out, the sound weak and pathetic, nothing like the booming voice that commanded boardrooms. Think about our reputation. Think about what this will do to us. There is no us, Mark, I replied, stepping away from the desk, moving toward the front door where I knew the flashing blue lights would soon appear. You dissolved us when you decided my signature was just a scribble you could replicate, and my trust was just an obstacle to your greed. Now, you get to face the consequence of treating me like an accessory instead of a partner. The doorbell rang, a sharp, insistent sound that sliced through the tension. It was the sound of the future arriving. I opened the door, standing aside to reveal 2 uniformed officers and Detective Miller. "Thank you for coming, Detective," I said, my voice steady, my gaze never leaving Mark, who now looked like an old, hunted animal trapped in a corner. "The subject is waiting." This wasn't just vengeance. It was reclaiming my identity, my financial security, and the dignity he had tried to steal. If you ever feel that tiny, cold seed of doubt about someone you trust, listen to it. Don't dismiss it as paranoia. That tiny doubt might just be the only thing standing between you and complete catastrophe. And if you've gone through something similar, share your story, because silence is what allows the darkness to thrive. But that realization, that cold, hard resolution I felt standing across from him in the sterile conference room, didn't appear overnight. It was forged in months of insidious doubt, a slow, corrosive poison that started as a whisper and grew into a scream I couldn't silence. To understand the fury of that final confrontation, the one where I finally saw him flinch like an animal trapped in a corner, you have to go back to the perfect, beautiful lie we were living. My name is Eleanor, and until 10 months ago, I was certain I had built a life immune to the cruelties of the outside world, centered entirely around the man I loved, Michael. He was the anchor, the charismatic force behind our successful architectural firm, the one who handled the high-stakes deals and the complex financials. I handled the design, the artistic vision. It was a perfect split, founded on absolute, unquestioning trust. We shared everything, our home, our dreams, and every single bank account. The first tremor was so faint I almost missed it. It was a canceled check, nothing dramatic. We had always paid the annual retainer for our property lawyer on time, usually weeks in advance. This time, the lawyer's office called, slightly apologetic, inquiring about the delay. Michael, standing right there, waved it off with his easy charm, already dialing their number. "Amateur clerical error, darling," he'd murmured, kissing my forehead. "I'll sort it out immediately." And he did. I dismissed it as exactly what he said, a clerical error, a hiccup in a system run by humans. But the hiccup repeated. 2 weeks later, a quarterly investment statement arrived, addressed only to him, tucked underneath a stack of junk mail, something he never did. We had agreed all financial mail would be opened together. When I asked, he seemed mildly irritated, a flicker of impatience I hadn't seen before. "It's just noise, Elle. The usual portfolio update. I filed it. Why are you digging through the recycling?" The defensiveness felt disproportionate to the question. That night, I couldn't sleep. The tiny cold seed of doubt had been planted. I tried to rationalize it away. Stress from the new merger, long hours. Maybe he was just tired of my meticulous organization. But the seed needed watering. I noticed he started taking more calls in the garage, specifically after 9 p.m. They were always hushed, ending abruptly when I walked into the kitchen for water. "Just a late call with a client in Dubai," he'd explain, his eyes meeting mine a fraction of a second too late. Dubai. At 9:15 p.m. Pacific time. It felt thin, paper thin, yet I swallowed it because the alternative, that the man I shared a bed with, the man who held my hand every morning, was deceiving me, was simply too terrifying to contemplate. The investigation began subtly, fueled by terror and a growing sense of violation. It started with the digital trail. I knew his primary passwords, of course, the ones we used for shared accounts. But those accounts were pristine, meticulously maintained, perfectly reflecting the image of success we projected. It was too clean. I needed to look where he didn't think I would look, the places reserved for true privacy. 1. Tuesday, Michael flew to New York for what he called a critical investor meeting. This was my window. I didn't break into his life. I simply walked deeper into the labyrinth of his secrets. I went straight to the garage, not looking for physical evidence, but for the laptop bag he'd insisted on keeping separate from his main briefcase. Inside, buried beneath some old schematics, I found it. A cheap burner smartphone. It wasn't encrypted. A rookie mistake, but one born from arrogance, the belief that I would never look. The moment I powered up that phone, the bottom fell out of my world. The screen lit up with a barrage of texts, not professional correspondence, but detailed explicit instructions for fund transfers, accounts I had never seen, and cryptic communication with someone named V. They weren't just discussing money. They were discussing our money, the capital reserves for the firm, the trust fund my grandmother had left me. They weren't investing it. They were systematically moving it, bleeding the firm dry through a complex shell company structure. My hands shook so violently I nearly dropped the cheap device. It wasn't just a betrayal of our marriage. It was criminal financial fraud, orchestrated by my husband. He wasn't tired. He was calculating. He wasn't stressed. He was stealing. The money was disappearing, routed through offshore accounts, destined for some private, inaccessible future he was planning without me. I scrolled through the history, my mind racing to keep up with the cascading destruction. There was a meeting scheduled for the following Friday, a final liquidation. If I didn't act immediately, everything would be gone. My professional legacy, my financial stability, my future, all reduced to zero by the man who pledged to protect me. The shock gave way to a chilling, razor-sharp clarity. The sweet, loving Michael I knew was a mask. Perfectly sculpted too, keep me complacent while he executed his escape plan. I couldn't confront him yet. That would spook him and accelerate the timeline. I had to become just as meticulous, just as calculating, but with a righteous fury fueling my actions. I spent the next 3 days living a double life. By day, I was the devoted wife, sending Michael cheerful texts about dinner plans and wishing him luck with the meeting. By night, I was a ghost, meticulously documenting every transfer, every text, every incriminating detail on that burner phone. I contacted a forensic accountant I trusted implicitly, a woman named Diana, under the strictest veil of secrecy. I didn't tell her who the subject was, only that I needed a complete financial profile and an emergency restraining order prepared for immediate deployment. "This is airtight, Eleanor," Diana said during our late-night call, her voice low and serious. "But you need to move the second we file this. He's closing the loop quickly." I knew exactly when I needed to strike. Friday morning, 9:30 a.m. The final closing on the largest shell account. That was when he would be exposed, and that was when I would reclaim what was mine. I printed everything, storing the evidence in a secure deposit box far from our home, feeling the heavy weight of the inevitable showdown settling on my shoulders. I looked at the wedding photograph on my bedside table, the image of Michael smiling genuinely, and felt nothing but cold, clinical detachment. The love was dead. Only justice remained. When Michael returned on Thursday night, tired but oddly buoyant, he kissed me and told me he had a big surprise planned for the weekend. "A huge success, darling," he beamed, completely oblivious to the silent, lethal plan unfolding around him. I smiled back, pouring him a drink, my acting skills perfected by years of professional negotiation. I played the part of the trusting wife one last time, all the while knowing that in less than 12 hours, the facade would shatter, and he would finally see the woman he had underestimated. The subject was waiting, and I was about to deliver the vengeance that was long overdue. If you've ever ignored that knot in your stomach because believing the lie was easier, let me tell you, facing the truth, no matter how catastrophic, is the only path back to real power. Don't wait until the funds are gone. Look now. It started with the silence. Not the comfortable quiet of a shared life, but a cold vacuum where intimacy used to be. For months, I had played the role of the willfully ignorant fool, convincing myself that the sudden shift in our finances, the canceled vacations, the vague excuses about market volatility, were normal stress factors for a man climbing the corporate ladder. But the knot in my stomach, the one I mentioned, tightened every time James smiled that perfect, reassuring smile. It was the smile of a man who knew he was winning, and I was beginning to suspect I wasn't on his team anymore. The first concrete sign wasn't a lipstick stain or a frantic text message. It was a receipt. Tucked deep into the pocket of his bespoke suit jacket, meant for the dry cleaner, was a small, folded slip of paper from a boutique jewelry store 3 states away. It wasn't an invoice for the standard anniversary bracelet or a replacement watch. It was for a custom engraved pendant, a design I had once casually mentioned I hated, with initials that were definitely not mine. A.L. I stared at the tiny, faded thermal printout until the letters blurred, feeling the foundation of my reality turn to ash. That was the moment the trusting wife died, and the operative took over. I realized then that if he was capable of meticulously planning an elaborate affair, complete with gifts purchased out of state and laundered through business trips, he was capable of hiding much more. My investigation became my full-time job, executed with the precision of someone trained to dismantle systems, not build homes. I started small, monitoring his phone usage. James was meticulous about deleting history and texts, but what he didn't account for was the metadata. A deep dive into the household Wi-Fi router logs showed a pattern: late-night connections to a specific encrypted messaging service, always coinciding with his supposed client dinners. The financial trail was the easiest to follow, yet the most painful. He hadn't just been spending money, he had been systematically liquidating our joint assets and transferring funds into offshore accounts with dizzying complexity. My background in financial analysis, which he had always dismissed as my cute little hobby, became my biggest weapon. I traced shell corporations registered in the Caymans, linking them back to a series of properties, purchased under a blind trust. The beneficiary of the trust was listed under a pseudonym, but the signature matched the clumsy script James used only when he was nervous. He wasn't just having an affair, he was preparing to vanish, taking everything we had built and leaving me with the wreckage. The discovery of the burner phone was the turning point from evidence gathering to mission execution. He kept it hidden in a hollowed-out classic novel on his bookshelf. Ironically, The Art of War. The contents confirmed every fear. Thousands of messages with Alice, discussing their future, their new house, and most damningly, a timeline for his departure. He planned to leave during my mother's scheduled surgery, a time he knew I would be distracted, vulnerable, and completely focused elsewhere. It was a calculated cruelty that chilled me to the bone, far beyond simple infidelity. He didn't just disrespect me, he saw me as an obstacle to be managed, and discarded at the optimal moment of weakness. My fury wasn't loud, it was surgical. It provided the clarity I needed to ignore the residual pain and focus on the mechanics of justice. For weeks, I continued to play the role of the doting, worried wife, offering him tea, listening intently to his stressed complaints about work pressure, all the while mirroring his deception. I learned to read the slight tightening around his eyes when he lied, the subtle shift in his wait when he was about to check the burner phone under the dinner table. Every shared meal, every casual touch, was an exercise in controlled performance. I was a ghost in my own life, observing the man who planned to erase me. The day before my mother's surgery was the day James finalized his escape plan. I watched him pack a small, expensive leather bag, ostensibly for an overnight business trip. He gave me a kiss on the forehead, a gesture so perfunctory it felt like a stamp of finality. "I'll call you when I land, darling. Everything will be fine with your mother." He said it with the confidence of a man who had already ensured his everything would be fine. But by then, I had already moved. While he was busy deleting his last few incriminating texts, I was busy executing the final phase of my strategy. The legal papers weren't just ready. They were filed, sealed, and waiting. The transfers of the stolen joint funds back into legitimate accounts were already underway, meticulously following the convoluted trail he had laid, but in reverse. He thought he had 12 hours until he could step onto that plane and start his new life with Alice and our money. What he didn't know was that the subject I was waiting for The vengeance that was long overdue was about to be delivered not by a tearful, betrayed wife, but by a woman who had used his own arrogance as leverage. As the sun set that evening, I sat alone in the living room we had once furnished with such hope, sipping the finest whiskey he had ever bought me. I looked at the burner phone, now resting on the table, its screen dark. I had copied everything, secured everything, and now I was ready to close the chapter. If you are currently feeling that dull ache, that nagging sense that something is deeply wrong, stop waiting for proof to arrive in a dramatic flourish. It rarely does. It comes in tiny, irritating details, the misplaced receipts, the deleted history, the sudden silences. Your intuition is not hysterical. It is survival. Do not allow comfort to blind you to catastrophe. Start looking, start logging, and understand this. The moment you stop fearing the truth, no matter how catastrophic, is the moment you reclaim your power. Don't let them write the ending of your story. Take the pen now. Because 12 hours from now, James was going to find out that the loving wife he left behind was actually the one who pulled the trigger. I found the key nestled beneath the lining of the jewelry box, specifically under the antique silver locket I gave her on our 5th anniversary. It was small, cold, and utterly foreign. Not a house key, not a car key, but the dull brass square typically used for a safety deposit box or a high-security storage unit. That tiny piece of metal was the physical manifestation of the static electricity that had been buzzing between us for months, the proof that the silence wasn't protective. It was concealment. My hands were shaking, but not from fear yet. It was the adrenaline of confirmation, the devastating relief of knowing I wasn't going insane. For weeks, I had been cycling through the same agonizing loop. She loves me, but why the whispered phone calls? She is faithful, but why did she bleach the rug in the study? She is just stressed, but why did she look at me last Tuesday with eyes that were utterly empty, like looking at a stranger across a vast, frozen lake? I had dismissed the gut punches as anxiety, convinced myself that marriage simply evolved into a series of comfortable, slightly paranoid compromises. But intuition, as the frantic voice on the other end of the line had warned me, is survival. And my survival instincts were screaming bloody murder. The previous signs, once scattered dust motes, now coalesced into a suffocating cloud. The deleted browsing history wasn't just about hiding a surprise purchase. The gaps in her monthly calendar weren't just overlooked appointments. They were carefully crafted omissions, holes punched into the fabric of our shared reality. I started logging everything, copying the advice I'd foolishly ignored earlier. I tracked the mileage on her SUV, 15 miles over what her reported trips to the gym and the market should have accounted for. I cross-referenced the dates of those extra miles with strange, small withdrawals from an ATM across town near the industrial park. None of it pointed to infidelity in the conventional sense. There were no passionate texts, no hotel receipts. This felt colder, sharper, far more calculated. This felt like business. I drove to the bank first, the key burning a hole in my pocket. My mind raced, trying to formulate a plausible excuse. But when I reached the counter, the teller politely informed me that the key belonged to a private, third-party storage facility miles away, one specializing in secure, long-term asset storage, not banking. The distance explained the extra mileage. The nature of the facility explained the secrecy. The drive out to the industrial park was surreal. The world outside the car window, the familiar sun, the smiling faces walking dogs, seemed utterly detached from the horror unfolding inside my chest. This wasn't just about saving my marriage. This was about saving my life. Although I couldn't articulate why yet. I kept replaying her smile at breakfast, her effortless grace, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear. How could that person be hiding something requiring high-security storage? When I arrived, the facility was sterile and nondescript. I I presented the key and the accompanying registration slip, which was registered to a shell company address I didn't recognize, to the attendant. He barely looked up, gave me a map, and pointed toward the rear of the enormous echoing complex. Unit 417. The air inside the storage corridor was stale and metallic. Every step I took amplified the silence, transforming the industrial quiet into a deafening countdown. I knew, absolutely knew, that whatever was behind that steel door would shatter everything I believed about my life. The man I was walking away from was a man who still believed in happily ever after. The man who would open this lock was about to become an entirely, different species of wreckage. I reached Unit 417. The lock was heavy-duty, designed to withstand more than just a casual break-in. My hands were slick with sweat as I inserted the brass key. It turned with a satisfying, expensive thunk. I pulled the heavy door open, stepping back, bracing myself for the sight of someone else's clothes, perhaps a stack of fraudulent documents, maybe just a collection of embarrassing old hobbies. What I found was none of those things. The unit was sparsely furnished, but meticulously organized. There was a large, bolted-down safe in the corner, a military-grade filing cabinet, and a small folding table littered with documents. But my gaze snagged instantly on the object sitting squarely on the table, illuminated by the harsh, single overhead bulb. A rifle case, long and black, tucked next to a stack of manila folders labeled with my name, James Halloway. My breath hitched. My throat seized up. I didn't need to open the case to know what was inside. But the filing cabinet was the real punch to the gut. It wasn't full of cash or jewelry. It was full of papers detailing the financials of my small engineering firm, insurance policies that listed her as the sole beneficiary, and, most damningly, a printout of a highly specific, very large life insurance policy I had completely forgotten signing 2 years ago when the company was doing extremely well. The policy had one critical clause highlighted in fluorescent pink: payout accelerated in the event of accidental death. I pulled the folders labeled Halloway J, Timeline and Execution. Inside, there were detailed surveillance photos of my daily routine, notes on my commute, and, terrifyingly, schematics of the internal wiring of our home's security system, showing the exact point where a remote override could be activated. The room swam. I leaned against the cold metal door, trying to process the scale of the premeditated betrayal. This wasn't a spontaneous act of passion or anger. This was years of planning, detailed and patient, carried out by the woman who slept next to me every night. She hadn't been planning to leave me. She had been planning to erase me. Then I saw the final document on the table, tucked neatly beside the rifle case. It was a recent printout of a news article dated just last month about a tragic hunting accident involving a man who mistook his friend for game in the dense woods upstate. The accompanying text, handwritten by her in her elegant, familiar script, simply read, "Alibi secured. The woods are perfect this weekend." My mind flashed back to the prior night. "James," she had said, her voice soft, kissing my cheek. "Don't forget we're going up to the cabin tomorrow. Just you and me. I packed everything." 12 hours. The countdown was almost over. The loving wife I left behind wasn't just unfaithful or unhappy. She was a meticulous, cold-blooded killer, and I was scheduled to be her next, final victim. The moment I stopped fearing the truth, I realized, was the moment I had to start running, because the truth was already holding the gun. Now, I had to decide if I confront her or disappear entirely, knowing that either choice might be the last move I ever make. The phone felt impossibly heavy in my hand as I dialed the only number I knew could help, knowing that calling the police might only speed up her timeline. This was not a story of divorce. It was a race against a bullet. And she had already loaded the magazine. The cold plastic of the phone burned against my ear, even though I hadn't pressed the call button yet. Dialing 911 meant introducing chaos into a perfect, deadly system she had constructed. If they came, she would know instantly. She would vanish, leaving me as the hysterical husband pointing fingers at a ghost. Or worse, she would preemptively strike, turning the narrative against me before I could utter a single truthful word. I lowered the phone, the screen lighting up my trembling hand. The stark white light, a cruel spotlight on my terror. This wasn't about surviving a relationship. This was about surviving an identity crisis where my wife was the predator and I was the unsuspecting prey, suddenly aware of the scent of blood in the air. My name is Ethan, and until 3 weeks ago, I lived a textbook life, successful architectural firm, a beautiful house overlooking the bay, and Sarah, my anchor. Sarah, with her dazzling smile, her meticulous organizational skills, and her unnerving ability to predict my needs before I voiced them. Looking back, those very qualities, the perfection, the flawless organization, were the first, most terrifying clues. They were too clean, too sharp, like the edges of a razor blade disguised as a bookmark. The first real flicker of doubt wasn't a dramatic discovery. It was a misplaced key. Sarah always kept the mahogany desk in her study locked, claiming it held sensitive client files. It was an unspoken rule. Her study was her territory. One Tuesday, rushing out for a late meeting, she left the antique brass key dangling right in the lock. It stared at me from across the hallway, a small gleaming invitation to forbidden knowledge. I stood there for 5 full minutes, battling the insidious curiosity against the ingrained trust of 8 years of marriage. Trust won initially, but doubt had planted its parasitic seed. That seed sprouted 3 days later. I was looking for the spare projector bulb in the garage, rummaging through a rarely used high shelf, when I noticed a heavy, military-grade storage container, the kind designed to withstand extreme temperatures. Sarah had told me it contained old hiking gear from her college days. I knew Sarah. Sarah hated camping. Her college days, studying art history, not scaling mountains. The lock on the container was a standard combination, but she'd used our wedding date. It was a sentimental irony so sickeningly sweet it almost made me vomit when I realized the access code. My hands were shaking so violently I had to input the numbers 3 times. The latch clicked. It wasn't hiking gear. Inside, resting on a bed of heavy foam padding, lay a disassembled 9mm pistol, dark and menacing. Beside cloth were 3 fully loaded magazines. My mind, trained in structural integrity and aesthetic design, struggled to reconcile this brutal, efficient tool with the woman who debated the nuances of Italian ceramics with me every weekend. But the gun wasn't the worst of it. Tucked beneath the foam was a small, sealed plastic pouch. Inside, 2 identification cards. One was an impeccably forged driver's license for a Catherine Vance, Sarah's face, but the cold, empty. The kind of eyes you see in surveillance footage, not across the breakfast table. The other was a passport, issued by a country I couldn't immediately place, bearing the same chillingly altered photograph. Catherine Vance. The date of birth on the false ID suggested she was 4 years older than she claimed. Everything she had told me about her past, the family farm in Oregon, the summer job volunteering, was meticulously fabricated. I spent it living a dual existence. During the day, I was Ethan, the devoted husband, discussing renovations and dinner plans. At night, I was a terrified amateur detective, cross-referencing names, dates, and locations. I found financial transfers into offshore accounts, small, consistent payments that added up to a fortune. I found encrypted emails discussing contracts and assets. I learned that Catherine Vance was a ghost who had occasionally surfaced in reports, always related to highly protected targets, always involving surgical precision and 0 collateral damage. She wasn't just hiding a past. She was actively operating in a present that could implode my life at any moment. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The reason our life was so perfect was that it was a cover. My stability, my predictable career, my comfortable home. I wasn't her husband. I was the perfect structural lay. I was the respectable facade behind which the assassin, Catherine Vance, rested between missions. The moment I confronted her, the flash forward that still leaves the metallic taste of fear in my mouth, happened yesterday afternoon. I'd placed the fake passport back in the container, but I'd deliberately left the key slightly ajar in the mahogany desk. A test. She returned home 2 hours later than expected. I was in the living room, pretending to read blueprints. "Art?" I asked, my voice impossibly steady. She smiled, that familiar, blinding smile that could charm a jury. "Terrible traffic, darling. Did you have a good day?" She went straight into the study, closing the door behind her. 30 seconds later, the study door swung open again. She wasn't smiling. She didn't have the gun yet, but the look in her eyes was the sight of the safety coming off. The perfection had shattered, revealing the coiled wire beneath. She said, her voice low, level, and utterly devoid of the warmth I had believed in for nearly a decade. "Did you touch my desk?" I knew then that the game was over. There was no negotiation, no explanation required. Knowing the truth, I realized, was the moment I had to start running, because the truth was already holding the gun. Now, I had to decide if I confront her or disappear entirely, knowing that either choice might be the last move I ever make. The phone. Heavy in my hand as I dialed the only number I knew could help, knowing that calling the police might only speed up her timeline. This was not a story of divorce. It was a race against a bullet. And she had already loaded the magazine. Now she was gone again, supposedly running errands, but I knew better. She was tying up loose ends, deciding if the Ethan loose end needed to be permanently severed. I had 30 minutes, maybe less. The police were too slow. I needed speed and silence. I needed to move before the perfect life I inhabited became the perfectly constructed tomb. I put the phone down, grabbed my keys, and headed not for the front door, but for the basement window I knew was always slightly sticky and unlocked. If Catherine Vance wanted a confrontation, she would find an empty shell of a house and a husband who finally understood the stakes of sleeping with an operative. I had to disappear without adopting the very ghostliness she mastered, because only a ghost can survive a hunter of her caliber. I just hoped she hadn't anticipated the basement escape route. She accounted for everything, except perhaps the depth of my sudden, cold terror. The window creaked, loud as a cannon in the silence, and I slipped out into the thick evening air, praying the sound hadn't carried. My new life had begun, and it smelled distinctly of concrete and desperation. The damp clothes, a primal camouflage. I didn't run. Running was a noise. I moved, low and fast, sticking to the deep shadows cast by the row of overgrown pines that bordered the property line. Every muscle in my body was coiled wire, waiting for the inevitable shout, the beam of a flashlight, the quick, lethal footsteps I knew so well. But the silence held, thick and suffocating, interrupted only by the frantic drumming in my own chest. She was either still, convinced I was hiding under a bed, or she was already halfway to the garage, anticipating my vehicle. I had planned for this moment years ago, back when the first subtle cracks appeared in her perfect veneer, when the casual dismissiveness morphed into possessive control, and the warmth in her eyes turned cold and calculating. My emergency fund wasn't tucked into a bank account. It was 50 crisp $100 bills sewn into the lining of the sea in the utility closet, a coat she never wore. And my means of transportation wasn't the car she tracked. It was the beaten-up bicycle I'd bought from a neighbor months ago, stored 3 blocks away in a dilapidated shed I rented using a fake ID and prepaid debit cards. Reaching the shed felt like walking across hot coals. The lock clicked softly, a sound that nevertheless felt deafening in the sleeping suburb. I pulled out the bike, its chain squeaking and started pedaling. Not towards the highway, not towards a city she knew, but deep into the winding backroads, towards the small, forgotten railway station 20 miles away that only serviced local freight and the occasional early morning commuter. The darkness was my only friend, masking the sheer terror that threatened to paralyze my legs. Every passing car became her car. Every distant siren became the sound of my capture. I pedaled until my lungs, vision blurred, fueled purely by the raw instinct for survival. When I finally reached the derelict station at 4 a.m., the air was sharp with the promise of dawn. I dumped the bike behind a dumpster, retrieving only the small, heavy backpack I had secured to the frame, containing the cash, a burner phone I had yet to activate, and copies of my essential papers hidden under layers of fake documents. My solution wasn't elaborate. It was simple, messy, and based on my of my former self. I wasn't just changing towns. I was shedding my skin. I took the first train heading south, destination utterly irrelevant, as long as it kept moving. For the next 3 weeks, I existed in transit. Bus stations, cheap motels paid for in cash, always moving, always watching. I avoided mirrors because the face staring back was too recognizable, too linked to the history I was desperately trying to erase. I cut my hair raggedly myself in room and dyed it a harsh, unnatural black. I adopted a uniform of anonymity, oversized hoodies, dark jeans, and a perpetually lowered gaze. The final destination settled on me more than I chose it. A sprawling, featureless city in the Midwest, far from both coasts, a place known for its data centers and its oppressive gray weather. It was the perfect hiding spot, a city where everyone was busy, and no one cared who you were, as long as you paid your rent on. I found a tiny third-floor apartment overlooking an alleyway, paid 6 months in advance with a fictional name, and started working cash-in-hand cleaning offices overnight. The silence here was different from the silence in her house. That silence had been a predator waiting to strike. This silence was simply empty. Lonely, yes, but safe. The first few months were dominated by hypervigilance. I slept lightly, waking at every creak, checking the locks obsessively. Not even in my head sometimes. I became adept at blending into the background noise, a skill honed by the years I spent unknowingly living with a master of camouflage. I lived off instant noodles and coffee, the only luxuries being the uninterrupted dark and the anonymity that felt colder and harder than any concrete. But slowly, painfully, the fear began to recede, replaced by a deep, aching emptiness. I was free, but I was also entirely alone. Was the total loss of trust. I learned the hard way that the most dangerous monsters do not lurk in the shadows. They live in the light, masquerading as your greatest love. They build a life with you, brick by perfect brick, only so they can watch you burn inside the structure they created. Her perfection, her flawless career, her impeccable manners, her unwavering affection. It had all been the bait, the most elaborate and cruel trap imaginable. I often think the truth, not in a grand confrontation, but in a spreadsheet. The meticulous planning of my isolation, the gradual redirection of my assets, the terrifying realization that she hadn't married me for love, but for control and eventual extraction. She was a master strategist, and I was merely a resource to be managed, a prized possession whose value was calculated solely in terms of what could be taken away. Now, years later, I still live here, In the tiny apartment. The windows are always locked, the blinds always drawn. I have no friends, no pets, and no digital footprint that connects to the person I used to be. I am careful, endlessly careful. Sometimes when I'm sweeping the cold marble floor of a corporate lobby at 3 a.m., I look up at the security camera and wonder if she's still looking, if she knows I survived her masterpiece of destruction. I suspect she does. A hunter never forgets the prey that... They simply recalibrate the hunt. But I am no longer just prey. I am a ghost, untraceable, silent, perpetually moving in the periphery. And that, I realized, is the only way to beat someone who thinks they own your soul. You have to prove you never had one to begin with. The life I left behind was a beautiful lie. The life I live now is a harsh, solitary truth, but it is unequivocally mine. The lesson burned into me is this: always listen to that tiny, nagging doubt. Perfect, too smooth, too good to be true. It's probably because the foundation is built on lies, ready to crumble the moment you step too heavily. If you have ever felt that cold knot of suspicion, that feeling that the person sleeping next to you isn't who they claim to be, don't dismiss it. Because ignoring the subtle signs of danger in a relationship is not loyalty, it's an invitation for disaster. Tell me, have you ever looked at someone you love? Chill. A deep, unsettling feeling that something dark lurks just beneath the surface of their smile? Don't keep that fear locked inside. Share your stories of intuition and warning signs. We might just save someone else who is still trapped in the perfectly designed cage I narrowly escaped.